It is September 11th, 1777. A British officer is lying in the brush at the edge of a wood, and he happens to be the best shot in the entire British Army. 100 yards out, an American officer is riding slowly along the tree line, tall and calm with no idea he is there. For this particular marksman, it is not a difficult shot. It is barely a shot at all. It is a formality. His finger finds the trigger, and then he does something almost impossible to believe. He decides not to be rude. And 3 years from now, that one decision is going to look unbelievably ironic. He does not fire. He calls out instead. He actually shouts to get the man's attention and warn him, because shooting someone in the back feels, to him, beneath a gentleman. The officer glances back, turns his horse, and simply rides away. And the best shot in the British Army lowers his rifle and watches the single most important target in the entire war disappear over a hill. Because of that one decision, you exist. Your country exists, and he is going to spend the rest of his short life with no idea what he just did. Because the calm man he so graciously let live was George Washington, not the outcome of a battle, not a treaty signed in some distant palace. The existence of the United States came down to one man's sense of manners on one ordinary afternoon in a field most Americans have never even heard of. To understand how insane this is, you have to understand the man in the bush. Patrick Ferguson was not some farm boy who got lucky. He was a Scottish officer and a flat-out marksmanship prodigy, the kind of man who could shoot a playing card in half while everyone around him was still figuring out which end of the gun is the dangerous one. And he was not even using a standard musket. He had invented his own rifle, one that loaded from the back and fired faster, farther, and straighter than anything else on the field. The British Army took one look at this superior weapon and decided, no thanks, because nothing says world's most powerful empire like turning down a free upgrade out of pure stubbornness. So they let Ferguson keep a few of his rifles and a small band of sharpshooters, and on that September morning, at the Battle of Brandywine, that is exactly where he was. The best shot in the Army, holding the best gun on the field, with George Washington riding straight into his sights. And Brandywine was not some minor skirmish. It was the single largest battle of the entire Revolution. Tens of thousands of men, the British driving hard on Philadelphia, the rebel capital. The whole thing was a sprawling, smoke-choked mess across miles of Pennsylvania farmland, which is exactly why the commander of the American Army was personally out riding the lines, trying to see with his own eyes what was falling apart. And that is how the single most important man in America ended up alone in an open field, directly in front of the one British soldier most capable of killing him. And here is what makes Ferguson's restraint matter even more. Washington lost that day. Brandywine was a defeat, and within weeks the British took Philadelphia exactly as feared. But the Revolution could survive a lost battle. It could even survive a lost capital, because a city can always be taken back later. What it could not survive was a lost Washington. Everything else on that field was replaceable. He was not. Which means the most important thing that happened at the Battle of Brandywine was not the battle. It was a single shot that never went off. And now we have to talk about that warning because it is the part that genuinely breaks people's brains. Ferguson did not hesitate because the shot was hard. He hesitated and then deliberately tipped off his own target because the 18th century had rules. There was an entire code for how gentlemen were permitted to kill one another, and quietly picking off an officer who had his back turned was considered, of all things, dishonorable. This was the era when armies put on their brightest coats, lined up in 2 neat rows in an open field, and took turns firing at each other like the world's deadliest game of patty cake. So to a man like Ferguson, shooting Washington in the back was not clever, it was cheating. He would rather lose the most important target of the entire war than win it dishonorably, and that is exactly what he did. A few days later, lying wounded with his right elbow shattered by a musket ball, Ferguson heard from a captured American officer exactly who that calm man on the horse had been. And the remarkable part, which we only know because Ferguson wrote it down in a letter afterward, is that he was not even sorry. He said that even if he had known in the moment he could not have brought himself to shoot a man so coolly going about his duty, he had held the entire future of the United States in his sights, let it ride away, and by his own account, slept like a baby. And he may not have even been looking at a single target. Ferguson described 2 riders that day, and history has never identified the second. One theory is that it was a French officer in a hussar uniform, one of the foreign volunteers who had crossed an ocean to help, which means Ferguson may have had the father of the country and the foreign alliance both lined up together in one quiet little group, and he waved them on through. And here is the strangest part. This was not even the first time someone failed to kill George Washington. By 1777, the man was already building a reputation that bordered on the supernatural. But before we get to that, there is one wrinkle we have to deal with. Historians can never prove with absolute certainty that the writer Ferguson spared was Washington. He learned the name secondhand, and a few of them enjoy raising a skeptical eyebrow about the whole story. But the timing fits, the location fits. The description, a tall, unmistakably senior officer calmly scouting that exact stretch of field, fits one man almost perfectly. Ferguson believed it to the end of his life, and if it was not Washington, then history accidentally produced the single most convincing Washington impersonator who ever lived, because Washington truly was almost impossible to kill. Years earlier, as a young officer, he rode through an ambush so brutal that 2 horses were shot dead out from under him, and he walked away with 4 bullet holes torn through his coat and not a single scratch on his body. Later, at the Battle of Princeton, he rode straight into the gap between 2 firing lines, so close that one of his own officers covered his eyes rather than watch the general die. When the smoke cleared, Washington was still sitting there, untouched. His own soldiers had begun to quietly suspect that the man simply could not be killed. Patrick Ferguson, lowering his rifle in those woods at Brandywine, was just the latest to try and fail. Now take a moment to appreciate how thin this thread really is. In 1777, Washington very nearly was the revolution. He was the one man holding a starving, unpaid, half-barefoot army together, and there was no replacement. Congress did not have a spare Washington in a closet somewhere. Remove him in 1777, and the whole thing starts coming apart. No crossing of the Delaware, no surviving Valley Forge, no Yorktown, no United States. The Declaration of Independence becomes a historical footnote, a treasonous letter signed by men who lost, most of whom would have been hunted down and hanged for it. The boldest experiment in self-government in human history ends as a short, failed rebellion the empire quietly stamped out and the world mostly forgot. Which means the entire American experiment, the flags, the fireworks, the right to stand in a backyard and loudly disagree about politics, all of it survived because one British marksman had exceptionally good manners. If he pulls that trigger, history takes a hard left turn. No revolution, no independence, and you, in all likelihood, grow up a subject of the crown, eating something called a crumpet. We dodge that entire future by about 100 yards and one courteous Scotsman. But here's the part that makes the whole thing land like a hammer. Patrick Ferguson did not survive the war either. 3 years later, at a place called King's Mountain, he ran into the one kind of soldier his gentleman's code had never accounted for. American frontier riflemen who did not line up in neat rows, did not call out a warning first, and did not care in the slightest which direction you happened to be facing. They surrounded the hill and picked his men apart from behind the trees, and Ferguson, conspicuous to the very end, rode up and down his line on horseback, blowing a silver whistle to rally his troops, which is an elaborate way of announcing, "Please everyone, aim at me." So they did. He was hit again and again and again, and fell from his horse dead, with one foot still tangled in the stirrup. The greatest marksman in the British Army, the man who once spared an enemy because pulling the trigger felt impolite, was killed by a storm of American bullets fired by men who felt no such hesitation at all. So this 4th of July, remember this, September 11th, 1777, the best shot in the British Army had George Washington dead in his sights. One clear shot, one decision to be a gentleman, and the United States almost never happened. He gave Washington 100 yards and a free pass. The Revolution did not return the favor.